Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hope you're off to a good week and enjoying Bloomburrow and Magic the Gathering. So every Tuesday, I try to do the community deck techs, and this week we got 5 submissions, so thank you for getting your decks submitted. Appreciate it. The first one that we're going to talk about here is a list that was submitted by Edible Ball Bearings, but it's a best of 3 list by Hamhawks42, who is a fellow Magic the Gathering content creator. I really like watching their streams on Twitch, so always fun to see what Graham has been cooking up. And so Golgari Roots has been around for a little while, and we did get some interesting tools in Bloomburrow that I think help the archetype. So first off, let's talk about the core of the deck. So Rubber Belt Maverick is able to surveil, which helps you get stuff into your graveyard that you can then utilize to enable your Insidious Roots. And that's why it's called Golgari Roots. And so you can also exile it from the graveyard to give something a +1/+1, and that when you remove something from your graveyard, it triggers the Insidious Roots. So your tokens can also tap to add 1 mana of any color. And so every time that you remove a card from a graveyard, you get a 0/1 plant token, and then they get a +1/+1 counter. And you can get these plant tokens to be absolutely huge, right? And that's kind of the point of this deck. So we've also got Snarling Gorehound. I consider this part of the core. Whenever another creature you control power 2 or less enters, you surveil, again, putting more stuff into your graveyard so that you can then pull it out, do fun things with it. Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler, is also a core part of this deck. The downtick for -2, you mill 3 cards and then return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, which then can end up causing a surveil again, and can be very useful for kind of burying your opponent in that graveyard triggers off of the Insidious Roots. The other thing too is the uptick allows you to untap up to 1 target creature, and that allows you to untap something that maybe you have tapped for mana, so that line does happen. And the other thing too is you can use the activated abilities of your tokens to tap, so the tapping for mana is an activated ability, and because this gives them haste, you can immediately tap your tokens that are created off the Insidious Roots to give you mana the very turn that those tokens are coming into play. So usually how this plays out is that you create a couple of tokens, they tap, they create some more tokens, they tap, they create some more tokens, and you just kind of grow everything, and you don't attack that turn. You then are waiting for the next turn to be like, I have overpowered you, right? And so the deck is innately kind of, just by the strategy that's being employed, a little bit weak to the Wraths, anything that's going to wipe the board. But the deck isn't stuck if that's the case, because a lot of the cards that then go to the graveyard, you can just rebuild again. So they have to keep repeatedly wrathing you. So Pillage the Bog is one that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I think that works pretty well. It allows you to kind of dig for the combo piece that you're missing. And so the 2 that we got that are new, though, that I think really help the archetype is the Cash Grab. I think Cash Grab is going to be one that we see kind of just become part of the core of the deck. And because it enables putting things into your graveyard while also helping you dig for part of the combo. And same with the Osteomancer Adept, being able to cast a creature from your graveyard with foraging removes a lot of the cards from your graveyard. As long as you're removing creature cards, you can create a whole bunch, even if you're just using those creatures to forage, and then also play something from it, right? So I mean, like, you can get 4 tokens off of this ability just depending on what you're taking out of your graveyard. So I think that one's also going to be part of the core. Now, there are a couple of cards in this list that, or in the archetype, that I'm used to seeing that aren't in this list, and actually a lot of them are in the sideboard. So I was like, I like to run the Haywire Might in this archetype. Again, being able to sacrifice it as a way to fill the graveyard and give you that 2 life stabilization, as well as some artifact or enchantment hate, works pretty well. So I would probably be starting these in the main instead of in the sideboard, just personally. I also think Deep Cavern Bat is pretty good at disrupting your opponent's interaction and kind of helping slow the pace of the game down, so that you can have time to hit into your combo. And the Cut downs and duress also have not made it into this list, so I like to have a little bit more interaction, especially if we're getting attacked by a really aggressive deck like Mono Red or Dimir Midrange. It's nice to be able to slow the initial pace of the game down while you kind of get your roots starting to grow. And the duress then also helps you hate on the wraths. So I would probably be bringing in at least duress in the sideboard personally. Ham here was also running 23 lands instead of 24, and I would also be lowering the curve a little bit by removing the Skyfisher Spider and the Harvester of Misery. Really depends on how much Boros Convoke you're anticipating coming up against. I imagine they made this closer to the beginning of the rotation, where we all thought Boros Convoke... Well, Boros Convoke was kind of one of the main decks to beat, and I think we've seen it less compared to like Golgari Midrange, where this card is kind of a whiff, right? So if the list that you're coming up against has no -2 toughness, or it doesn't get hit by the -2 toughness, then you're it's not going to be a good card to include, right? And the Skyfisher Spider is kind of like interaction and does allow you to remove. You can sacrifice a creature and then destroy a non-land permanent, so it can be a way to kind of sacrifice your little 1-drops and bring them back, and it gives you that life stabilization from the graveyard. But I would rather be getting the life stabilization off of the Haywire Mites. So just personally would rather pull these out and still run like 24 lands, I think. Speaking about the lands too, we're not running the Restless Cottage in this list or the Underground Mortuary. And I think with the tap land that surveils is a pretty nice one to have in here. And the Restless Cottage then giving you an alternative win condition if your opponent is able to remove your Insidious Roots with a Pithing Needle effect, for example, right? The cards that I'm not sold on, I've already mentioned a little bit. So the Skyfisher Spider and the Harvester of Misery. The other one is the Voldaren Thrillseeker. So we do have the ability to tap for red off of Insidious Roots, because the tokens can tap for 1 mana of any color. And so we can play this from the graveyard. I'm not sure that... I mean, your roots do get really big, and one of the downsides is that maybe you can't actually get that damage through, because it doesn't have trample. If they're able to just chump block you with the 1/1s, might be why the Harvester of Misery is in here as well, to get around just the infinite amount of chump blockers. And this allows you to then fling one of your roots that has an 20 power to just win the game. So don't usually see it included. I'm not 100% sold on it, because I know sometimes it is going to be a brick in your hand. And the other one too is the Kinkerbloom. And Kinkerbloom kind of works the same as the Haywire Might, giving you that artifact and enchantment hate. The upside to this is that it can hit creatures, whereas this one is limited to non-creatures specifically. But this is a little bit cheaper to do than the Kinkerbloom, so I lean towards the Might. That being said, though, the cards that I like that I hadn't really considered that I like seeing included here are the Bone Cache Overseer, and because I do think that this one, especially with the cash grab, you're going to be able to do the forage thing, right? And even if you're not foraging specifically, this deck cycles enough through its own graveyard that you should be able to remove 3 or more cards from your graveyard just by bringing them into play. That the Overseer should be able to give you good card draw, and definitely worth exploring and checking out. So the card that I think I would probably explore in the best of 3 sideboard, so we have the cut downs that I was talking about that I'd usually run in the main. Again, that's probably just a personal preference about whether or not you keep it in the main or the sideboard. Anoint with Affliction for some instant speed interaction. Agathis' Soul Cauldron is kind of like the Unlicensed Hearse after rotation, so this is really going to help us hate on the opponent's graveyard. More Skyfisher Spiders, so I don't know what matchup Ham was thinking about specifically with that card, but I'm not sold on this yet. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. Deadly Cover-Up being a Wrath, and then the 2 more copies of Harvester of Misery. And I think the card that I would explore potentially over the Deadly Cover-Up is Season of Loss. So with the filling of your graveyard and such, similar to how a Skyfisher Spider can give you a fair amount of life based off of the number of creature cards in your graveyard, the Season of Loss is able to wipe your opponent's board and potentially hit them for a ton of damage based off of the amount of creatures in your graveyard. So something to explore maybe over the Harvesters of Misery, and maybe over the Skyfisher Spider. I would at least like to explore 1 or 2 copies. So thank you for your submission, Edible Ball Bearings. I hope that helps you understand the archetype and what was, you know, I need to talk to Graham about what what he was, why he loves the Skyfisher Spider so much. But thank you for your submission. All right, and we've got a mono red haste deck by Timback Trucking, and this one is all 1-drops. And because it is all 1-drops, we got 14 lands. And so this is kind of, this would, I think, in theory, work okay in best of 3, and I'm pretty sure it would work in best of 1. You might even be able to actually cheese it down to like 13 lands. But you're really, you know, flirting with getting a lot of 0 land starts with going too low. But I've seen lists that go all the way down to 12 even. But again, that one, it depends on how well the deck can close with like a 6 or even a 5 card starting hand. That being said, though, this is kind of like mono red, but going as low as we can go, right? And what I would be doing, my slightest little tweaks would be to run a 4th copy of the Mirror and Bane Splitter. And the only reason why I want this one at 4 is because of how well it works with the Heartfire Hero and the Cacophony Scamp, where if your opponent has removal, so like say you go to play, like they play a cut down, it ruins the whole interaction, right? But if they don't have the cut down and they have a Go for the Throat or a Bitter Triumph, or, you know, one of the one black removal spells, then this will be able to hit for 4 damage when they finally remove it, or 3 damage if they remove it from the Cacophony Scamp. So you're not going to be able to equip it again in this deck with the low mana count, but most of the time you're already losing the game if you are re-equipping the Mirror and Bane Splitter. So I think that would be something to consider, is bringing that one up to 4. And then the Dreadmaw's Ire, this one was, I think, so in the Rakdos aggro deck that went to Mythic that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, it was originally running 2, I think, Dreadmaw's Ires, and then the last meta review that I talked about yesterday was bumping the Dreadmaw's Ires up to 4 while dropping the land count down to 18. And so the question I have for you is, do you want to be going over the top of an opponent who is blocking you? And how well do you think this deck can do it with just the 1-drops, right? So like with the Monastery Swiftspear, they'd have to be able to put something with the 5 power on the Swiftspear, which they're not really going to have. So I think this pushes more damage than the War Squeak, right? So I get the War Squeak gives your Cacophony Scamp and your Heartfire Hero haste, but the other creatures, the Swiftspears and the Phoenix Chicks and the Lackeys, already have haste, right? And so I'm thinking that maybe instead of removing a blocker, you just go over the top of the blocker with the Dreadmaw's Ire. And so personally, I would be on 4 Bane Splitters and 4 Dreadmaw's Ire, and then probably play around with cutting 1 land. I know that I always say that you need 14 sources of red in best of 1 to be able to play your 1-drop, and you're kind of abusing the best of 1 hand smoother to go down below 14, because like 14 will work in a best of 3 theoretically for 1-drops, right? So either dropping a land or potentially dropping 2 War Squeaks and just playing the 2 of these, because I do get it that like if you run out of kind of gas, that you're able to use the War Squeaks to get over your opponent. So but I like where it's going. A deck full of 1s always makes me happy. The third submission was Moth the Brain's Golgari Food deck is what I'll call this. It's not strictly a Golgari Food list, but it's kind of a Golgari Food list that meets a Golgari Reanimator strategy. And so we've got a lot of the like Vine Reap Mentor, which gives us a food token. We've got the Camellia. Whenever you sacrifice a food, you create a squirrel token, and then you can forage and put +1/+1 counters on your squirrels. We've got Greta, who enters and creates a food token. We've got the Cash Grab, which creates a food token. We've got the Bristlebud Farmer, which creates a food token. And then we've got some just like big beaters, right? We've got the Archfiend of the Dross, We've got the Aclazotz. We've got the 2 copies of the Rottenmouth Viper, which is the new one we got in Bloomburrow, which can put a lot of pressure on your opponent, as well as use those food tokens to come out for a cheaper amount. Phyrexian Fleshgorger we can bring out as a 3-drop, and then when it dies, reanimate it as a 7-drop. That can be really difficult for them to pay the 7 life with the ward. And we have the Virtue of Persistence as a way to reanimate our graveyard, as well as the Lich Knight's Conquest to sacrifice the food tokens, or the Vat of Rebirth. So every time that we're sacrificing a food token, we're going to be able to put an oil counter on this, and then eventually remove the 4 oil counters to then activate the Vat of Rebirth. And the thing that's kind of interesting about the Bristlebud Farmer is being able to mill your cards and put a permanent from among them into your hands, so you can kind of bring back the Vat of Rebirth. So you don't have to sacrifice the Vat of Rebirth to be able to use it, though. So it's one of those things that, like, you can use it to pick up more if you want, right? I think personally what I would be doing is using Scavenger's Talent instead of Vat of Rebirth. I would at least explore it, right? Because you get the whenever a creature you control dies, you create a food token, so you get additional food tokens off. Like Mentor dies, you get 2 food tokens, right? Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you can then mill 2 cards, and so you could use this as an alternative win condition against some really grindy matchups. I doubt that will happen as much as just you targeting yourself, because this deck would benefit off of some self-mill, because the deck does not fill the graveyard particularly well. It does a little bit with the cash grabs and the Bristlebud Farmers, and like I've definitely seen worse decks at filling the graveyard, but Scavenger's Talent would then make it so that whenever you pop a food token for any of your like braids or whatever, right, that you're going to be filling your graveyard to give you more juicy reanimator targets like your Rottenmouth Viper, your Aclazotz, your Archfiend of the Dross. So something to consider. The other thing too is that personally I would either choose the Bitter Triumph or the Candy Grapple, and then run at least 3 copies of Cutdown. Depending on, I'm under the impression that this was designed for best of 3, so you could keep the Cutdowns in the sideboard. At some point you're going to want to get Cutdown in, just because it's a really nice card if you're up against Dimir midrange or mono red aggro. And so I'd like to bring it into the main personally and go with the 4 copies of the Bitter Triumph and take out the Candy Grapples for 3 copies of Cutdown personally, just because I know that you can bargain to use the food, but there's so many other cards in this deck that want to use that food for other things, even the Bristlebud Farmer, right? That I think that, you know, it's not necessarily the best like bargain deck, right? It's not like Hopeless Nightmare and such in here that is like really looking for needing that sacrifice outlet. The other thing too is 23 lands feels a little bit on the low side for the curve that you're going here. So like I know Virtue is kind of like a 2-drop that then becomes more expensive. The Fleshgorger is a 3-drop that then hopefully comes back. The Rottenmouth Vampire or Viper you're going to be playing for a discounted price. So maybe 23 is okay, but just like looking at how much this deck wants to hit 4, I really think that 24 feels right to me. Generally that's kind of what I look at, is 24 is the tipping point. If you run 25, 26, 27, then you're really looking at like hitting your 5-drops. And then 24 is kind of more about like, I want to make sure I hit 4. And then anything below 24 is where you start getting into like, okay, I'm going to have a higher chance of not actually hitting turn 4 or land 4 on turn 4, especially in best of 3 where you don't have the hand smoother. So personally, I would be on 1 more land. And the other thing too, just quickly about the lands in general, I know that you mentioned that the lands are kind of a work in progress. So currently there are 15 sources of black and 15 sources of green. And just to, you know, talk about it, I like to run 16 sources of green for a 2 double pip green like the Bristlebud Farmer. So I'd like to get 1 more green source in there. And then you also have the Archfiend of the Dross, that if you want to play on turn 4 and not have it be a brick in your hand, if you have 16, it's still going to be a brick in your hand like 10% of the time, right? So it's just about how often are you okay with that. And so this one would also want 16 sources of black. The Beseech the Mirror is usually reserved for a mono black deck or a space that has a little bit better fixing than something that's an equal split in green and black, because the one triple pip black, if you're going to want 21 sources of black to cast this on turn 4. Now again, you only have one of it, and it's not necessary to cast on turn 4. You could cast this much later into the game. It's still potentially going to be a brick in your hand, and that is so detrimental to the consistency of a deck that I tend to not mess around with it. So I would probably look at replacing Beseech the Mirror. I don't think it's super necessary in this deck in any way. The other thing too is 14 black and green sources that are untapped. So you've got like the Sunken Citadels and things like that, so you can't count those towards the Underground Mortuary, for example, towards those 14. I think when I counted it, you were actually close, but not quite there to the 14 untapped sources for a black-green card, which is pretty hard to cast, right? So if you want this on turn 2, try to get to the 14 and 14 of each with untapped sources. So that being said, especially if you're going to run it at 23 lands, I don't think that this deck can afford to do both Fountain Port and Mirrex, so I would choose probably one over the other. And I would probably lean towards the Fountain Port over the Mirrex, since it has more synergies with the food tokens specifically. So the other thing too is that you mentioned that you wanted to work on a best of 3 sideboard. So I threw together a sideboard. Duress helps against the control matchups against Azorius control, which we haven't been seeing a ton of in the meta, but tends to be a bit of a problem for this style of mid-range deck. Doesn't rebuild after Sunfall particularly well, so I think we would want to run some hand hate. And along those lines, I think we could also bring in Liliana of the Veil. Terra Sunder gives us some artifact and enchantment hate if we're coming up against Boros tokens or any of the Caretaker's Talents decks that I think we're going to see more of. I'd like to get some artifact hate in there. And same with the Tranquil Frillback, but also being able to play it in mono green to give you the life stabilization. And then Nissa Ascended Animist is a way to have additional repeatable artifact and enchantment hate, as well as giving you an overrun, which this deck doesn't really need because you have the evasion of coming off of the flying of Archfiend of the Dross. But, giving your Flesh Gorger trample, giving your big Viper trample is not that bad. And it gives you a Planeswalker, which gets around the Wraths if you are coming up against the White Wraths. So the Choking Miasma, I think, is in here for Boros. Like, we should have some sort of plan for the go wide strategies where our single point interaction in black tends to struggle with the go wide strategies that are playing cards that are multiple rectangles in one card. And so I think the Choking Miasma works pretty well for that. We could also do like the Harvester of Misery, but again, I think this curve is already kind of pushing the top end well enough. And then Gix's Command works really well too for the kind of quasi wrath. You could do like a Deadly Cover Up if you prefer that sort of thing. That way, again, having another tool to bring in against the go wide strategies. So there's only 14 because I wanted to be able to talk about Scavenger's Talent, because I think I would be playing it over the Vat of Rebirth in this deck. But the last card would be, you could run 2 Lilianas or, bump one of these up, would be where I start. So I hope you find that helpful. And I like the build. I feel like it's doing something different than what I've seen. So thank you for the submission. The fourth submission was Elvish Archivist Aggro by Shane S93. And this one, so being centered around so Elvish Archivist is a 0/1 that gets 2 +1/+1 counters every time that you play, every time an artifact enters the battlefield. And then when one or more enchantments enter, you draw a card. So you're kind of doing this like Selesnya artifact counters space. And to go with this, you've got the Teething Wormlet. For the enchantments, you've got like the Innkeeper's Talent, the Hunter's Talent. You've got the Parting Gust to go with the ETBs off of like Norn's Inquisitor and the Sandstorm Salvager. There's a little bit of synergies with the Steel Seraph, being able to play it as a prototype and then blink it as a 5/4 flyer, giving it the lifelink and such. Sentinel, the Nameless City, also has an Enters effect. So there's a couple of cards that work with the Parting Gust. And what I would like to see from this deck, and this is also just, a little bit of my own bias, right? Is I feel like this deck is going in too many directions at once, right? So I would like try to bring it into one or the other, right? So like Sandstorm Salvager, I would like there to be more abilities to blink this. We're gonna run this card. I'd like to be able to play like more Parting Gusts, and even more than 4 Parting Gusts. I'd like an additional way to get some value out of blinking the Sandstorm Salvager rather than just getting that 3/3 one time. I'd like that to be kind of like a theme of the deck. And then if we're blinking a bunch of things, then we should bring in the really powerful ETBs of like Beza, and you know, there's plenty of broken ETBs out there, Elish Norn, whatever, right? I mean, like White's got a lot of interesting ETBs. So that being said, if we're gonna go for the artifact side of things, I think I would want to see some more of the. So you had a sideboard with some of your ideas, and I just threw some together that I wanted to talk about. Like this deck's not running the tough cookie. Another one that we see a lot is like Novice Inspector because it creates that map token when it enters the battlefield. We've got the Yoshin Dissident, which I know some people have played around with the artifact counter space, and could be an interesting one to explore. Regal Bunnycorn feels pretty good if we're going to be creating all of these map tokens and things like that. That's usually that's one way that people have taken it. And I get that you're bringing in the enchantments for the card draw, and you were saying that you kind of wished there was a way to kind of to increase the amount of card draw in this archetype, or in this list. And one of the ways that people have done it is they've done it through Kellen. And so Kellen, as long as you make your creature deck, you need to make the deck more creature heavy if you're going to use Kellen to increase the chances of you hitting a creature that costs 3 or less from your library. Because right now you're on 23 land or 23 creatures, which is a little bit on the low side for a creature heavy deck. And so if you're going to bring in the Kellen, I would be cutting out some of the stuff like the Parting Gusts and maybe the Hunter's Talent, right? The Innkeeper's Talent, if you're leaning heavily into the tokens, I think is a place to explore. Spring-Loaded Saw Blades is a way to have removal at instant speed that also triggers an artifact. So if we're leaning away from the Parting Gust and taking out the Sandstorm Salvager, then I'd probably be bringing in the Spring-Loaded Saw Blades to lean more heavily into the artifact side of things and the artifact theme. The other thing too is if you do decide to go with Kellen, then I think a really nice substitution for the Steel Seraph is Dust Animist, and Dust Animist then being able to being hit by the Kellen Daring Traveler, but then also being able to give us this large flying lifelink and the +2/+2 2+1/+1 counters, then synergizes with the Innkeeper's Talent that gives you the card draw for Archivist, right? The other thing too that you could explore, I think I like the Tail Swipe more than the Talent, just because the Talent has to be done at sorcery speed, makes it a little bit more limited. And Parting Gust also is not going to help us against mono red prowess. So a lot of these comments I'm making are directed towards best of one specifically. And because Parting Gust is, you need a gratuitous amount of white sources to actually cast the Parting Gust on turn 2, right? So if you need to prevent the turn 3 win against Rakdos aggro, then Parting Gust is going to be a brick in your hand. And the only thing that you can really have to be like the Hail Mary to prevent that win is having one of the 2 copies in the deck of Get Lost, right? So I think I would probably increase the amount of Tail Swipes and Get Losts up a little bit. To be able to counter the mono red prowess, or Rakdos aggro specifically. I like the Pop Hatch formation, being able to give you that food token and cycle, as well as being artifact and enchantment hate. I've definitely seen this getting a lot more play. And the Norn's Inquisitor, I think, is one that is a little bit less isn't played as often as some of the other ETBs that trigger the artifact thing, unless you're leaning a little bit more heavily into the Incubator token, the Phyrexian token specifically. But it does work with the Parting Gust kind of idea of being able to blink your own stuff, right? So I feel like if you're going to go more towards the blink thing, lean more heavily into the blink thing. Otherwise, I think you could replace these with different cards that would help synergize with making the Teething Wormlet bigger, being able to play a really big threat like the Regal Bunnycorn, that sort of thing. The Archangel Elspeth, I just wanted to mention. This one's usually one that you see more in best of 3, but because of the White Wraths, the temporary lockdowns, the Sunfalls, the Starfall invocations are not going to hit Planeswalkers. It depends on how much you're coming up against those matchups, but the Archangel Elspeth can kind of help you, and it still does fit into the token strategy. And then Aven Interrupter is another one that I've seen run to bounce a Sunfall, bounce an Atraxa. You see it more commonly in best of 3, but if looking at this deck, I thought one of the things that it might struggle with is the Wraths. So both of these tools would help you against those matchups, against the white control. So Caretaker's Talent, I don't think I'd run the Innkeeper's Talent and the Caretaker's Talent. I think I would choose one or the other. And I think that the way I want to go with this deck is more towards the artifact counters side of things instead of the blink. And then I would rather have the card draw coming off of the Caretaker's Talent more than I would the token synergies off of the Innkeeper's Talent. So something to play around with, though this would be able to give another way to give your deck more dig. So the other thing too that I kind of forgot to mention, and I kind of segued into my second thought a little too quickly, was the Thousand Moon Smithy. I really, really want to be able to turn this land over as quickly as I can if I'm playing the Thousand Moon Smithy. And so some of these suggestions, like the Novice Inspector and the Tough Cookie, especially like the 1 and 2 drop creatures that give you additional rectangles, really helps be able to flip your Thousand Moon Smithy. So if you're going to include that one, then I would want to see a little bit more of the creature-centric stuff coming in, instead of running as many enchantments. And I mean, you've got a fair amount of instances between the Get Lost, the Parting Gust, and the Paw Patch Formation for a strictly creature kind of centric build, right? So the more that you want this sort of thing which really cares about you actually having creatures and not spells, like having that high spell count hurts the Thousand Moon Smithy. I'm not saying that point as best as I could, but I hope you get the idea, right? And this one too, like, I get what you're trying to do with the creating a copy of a token of a really big artifact or even just of a 3/3. And again, this card gets better the more creature spells that you have in the list, and I think you would want to be slightly higher than 23. So thank you again for your submission. Hope you like the the discussion and the thoughts. I hope it gives you some ideas, and looks like a fun archetype. All right, and then the 5th submission for this week is by Zigzag 2370, and this is this one gets points for creativity for sure. This deck is a what's the word I'm looking for? It's bold. It's it's doing 4 colors. Excuse me. It's doing 4 colors, but it's not doing. It doesn't have a lot of fixing for the 4 color space out of basically running every non-basic land possible, right? So this is a deck that's going to be particularly weak to Demolition Field kind of effects, right? Don't ever come up against a Furnace Punisher with this deck. But the whole point of it was to try to enable a Jeskai Ascendancy like we had in Khans of Tarkir, that I think it was Khans. It's been a while. Anyway, so the Ascendancy was able to untap all of your creatures, and that causes some really potentially crazy loops to happen, right? So the combo is we have Insidious Roots in play, which gives all of our tokens can tap 1 mana of any color. Song of Totentons, which we got Wilds of Eldraine, is able to create a bunch of Grat creatures that have haste, so they can immediately tap 4 mana. So we can do the Insidious Roots, play these all out, and then be able to tap them the turn that they come down. If we have the Floodcaller, then they all untap and are able to tap again. So that kind of being the main three cards in the deck for the engine of like what the combo is. and that's why it's 4 colors, is because it spans the 4 color spectrum. Notably, the Insidious Roots does not have a lot of ways in this build to affect the graveyard, so it cannot produce its own tokens, which would really help you kind of fix for the 4 color strategy. The other thing I'd like to talk about really quick with this deck is the core color of the deck is black. So our highest count of sources is 16 black, and then we have 12 red, and then we have 11 green, and then 9 blue. And I don't think that really matches what even the demands of the list currently is. We have more blue pips than we do green. So we might need to tweak the lands a little bit. Again, I think this was kind of thrown together as a proof of concept to see if this would be powerful enough to actually build around. And even then, I'm not really sure that it actually is. I think it's a lot of fun. It's definitely like a Johnny combo. But I'm not sure that it's like... This should just instantly win you the game. If it's a 3-card combo across 4 colors, right? Like, you should definitely win. And I'm not even sure you definitely win with this combo, right? Silver Scrutiny was put in here to draw cards. So if you have that, like all of those tokens that they can tap for mana and untap, then you can kind of dig for free with the Silver Scrutiny. And the 3 Steps Ahead, I think, was in here for the draw 2 and then discard a card, because it's definitely not in here for a counterspell with only the 9 sources of blue. So I think we could drop both copies of the 3 Steps Ahead as well as the Silver Scrutiny, because the Floodcaller only needs 10 sources of blue, and the Ill-Timed Explosion also around 10 sources of blue seems to do okay with this one. We don't need to play that until a little bit later. And as far as like actually digging through our deck with the Silver Scrutiny or the 3 Steps Ahead, we have cards that can help us do that in the Golgari space anyway. So we can use Stargaze or Pillage the Bog. I think both would help kind of eliminate some of the really restrictive mana burdens or mana restraints on this build. The other thing too is, since we are running 16 sources of black, I think we should run a full playset of the Malicious Eclipse, or run some Deadly Cover-Ups instead of the Ill-Timed Explosion. Make it just more centric on Black Wraths, because you need 18 sources of black to be able to play this on turn 3 90% of the time, and right now we're at 16, so it wouldn't be too hard to kind of push that up a little bit to get to the 18 sources. The 4 copies of Brotherhood's End seems really thin with the 12 sources of red. So I would personally be more towards like, let's run the only red in the deck is the Ill-Timed Explosion, or the earliest that we need the red is turn 4, because we can do the Song of Totentons much later in the game as a win condition. I would probably cut the Artist Talent. That way I don't have to worry about a brick that I can't play until much later in the game, and favor the Black Wrath over the Brotherhood's End as a way to kind of slow things down. And then I'd also probably play around with bringing in some black single point interaction to slow some of the aggressive strategies down, so that we could then make it to our Wraths. Especially like Assassin's Trophy, I'm not a really huge fan of, because of being able to like ramping your opponent can be really detrimental. You mentioned you really liked the Persistent March Stalker in this one. I'm not sold on it, just because of not really being able to fill your graveyard very well. There's a couple of ways you can, like discard into your graveyard, but there's not a whole lot of self-mill going on. I do like the Virtue of Persistence just as a 1 and a black for the interaction. I'd probably be keeping that. And excuse me. The last little bit is the like spelunking for all of your non-basics coming into play untapped seems fine. I kind of want there to be more just strict fixing for a 4-color space. So like Cornucopia I think would really help this deck if we were going to up the green count a little bit. And the 3 Merrics and 1 Fountain Port seems like way too many colorless lands, right? Especially if we're going to try to get some form of consistency in this deck. So I like it, though. I think that it seems fun at the very least, right? Because when you pull that combo off, it's gonna feel pretty good. So thank you for the submission, Zigzag, and hope my thoughts find you well. So if you would like my thoughts on one of your own decks, look for the deck submissions in the community tab. They should be posted at the same time as this video, and you have until I get around to the video sometime next week to submit your decks. And again, this is all just to hopefully be helpful and kind of just nerd out about Magic. So yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks for being a part of my community, and have a wonderful week. Tomorrow I will be posting my run against Nummy. So I played the Arena Open on Saturday and had a pretty excellent match against Nummy, where I definitely threw the game. But that's all I'm going to say. And that should be available tomorrow if I get it processed in time. So take care, everybody.